Hello, fifth graders. We are going to color and add value and shading to our candy drawing. It's gonna be super fun. So today I'm gonna use a blue for my shadow. I like using blue instead of black just because it's just more fun, it's more colorful. You can use any dark color you want for your shadow. Now, the shadow is going to go on the opposite side of where the light hits the object. That's what I'm showing you with the yellow color pencil. That is our pretend light source. So if one side of the object is bright with light, the other side has a shadow because the light doesn't touch it. And it creates a shadow on the table it's sitting on. So we are going to start with shadows, and then we will add the color value within the candy. So, okay, have your dark color ready. And I always start right next to the object and where it hits the table. And of course, do it on the opposite end of where your light source is. And just for consistency, so we're all doing the same thing, make sure your light source is on the top left, like mine. So your shadow will be on the opposite side. So I started with a darker value right next to the candy, where it's on the table. Okay, so now I have, I'm noticing that the wrapper also is going to need a little shadow. It still is a form, even though it's small and see-through. So I'm going to add my shadow all around the bottom of the circle, and then even a little bit further out past the wrapper. Now take a look at that shape that's forming with that darkest shadow value. It's almost a crescent. Do you see that dark blue crescent? I'd go ahead and do the same thing. If you're making a shadow for a circle candy, then definitely do a little crescent, and then the rest of the shadow is going to be more of a medium value. So it's not as dark, which means don't use as hard of a pressure when you press down. Now notice how I'm bringing the shadow over a little bit, because you have to keep in mind that wrapper and that wrapper's form. It has a form and it is kind of long. So that's why the shadow goes out a little. And I'm adding a darker value level right next to where the wrapper hits the table. Do you see that? So it's not a crescent shape because it's not coming off of a circle. But it is darker right where the wrapper hits the table. And I'm also giving a little bit of shadow here to the left. Be careful not to make it too dark though, because we are getting closer to that light source. So we don't want it to be too dark over there. Cool. I like it. I'm happy with my shadow. I might make sure it's blended well and go over it, so make sure that the dark value blends into the middle value. So yeah, it's always a good idea to check once you think you're done. I'm gonna add a little bit more. There we go. So it goes dark to the middle value. It's darkest right under the form, so right under the candy or right under the wrapper, and then it gets lighter. So here we go, we're going to repeat these steps, but the only difference is we have different shapes to work with. It's in different, different shaped candy and different shaped wrappers. So I'm going right where the candy or the form hits the table and making that the darkest. And then I'm doing the same thing where the wrapper hits the table, similar to how I just did the shadow in that circular candy. So then it's darkest where it meets the table and then lighter as you move away. So there are two different shades or values in this shadow, a dark and a medium. And you can make your shadow mimic or kind of mirror the shape of the candy. You can just make it similar to the shape. It doesn't need to be like perfect at all. None of this does. It's all just practice. But what I mean is the shadow doesn't have to be like exact. You can make your shadow look a little bit different and it'll totally look great and awesome. So if it's not exactly like mine, please don't worry. Now it's looking all right. I'm happy. There's another spot that is going to need a little shadow. I wonder if you can see it. Yep, right in there. Okay, so the wall of the candy, the inside wall of the candy is going to get some dark blue. That light would not hit that inside wall very easily, so I'm going to go ahead and make that darker. And it's darker next to where the object hits the table. And then it gets lighter the further away. All right, I'm gonna move over to this candy, and I'm gonna make sure that I know where I'm gonna put my darkest value, where the shadow's gonna go, and it's gonna go on the right-hand side, away from the light source. So yeah, so it's on the opposite side where the light would hit. And I'm gonna do a darker line and right next to where it hits the table. You might start to get the hang of it, and if you do, you can go at your own pace and follow along if you want, or slow down or go faster if you understand. So yeah, I'm just making it darker right where it hits the table, where the form hits the table, and then it gets a little bit lighter. So we're practicing lessening our pressure, or lightening your pressure, and making that middle value. And you see how I'm mimicking the shape of the roundness of that candy, and then I'm also kind of trying to mimic the shape of the wrapper too, where it bunches at the bottom. So you can see I'm actually drawing a shape that's pretty similar to it. It's not exact, and it might not be in the exact position, but it'll represent a shadow just fine. It'll look good. So I'm gonna make that a middle value, because it's always darker right where the candy is next to the object, and it's not right next to the object in this case. So here we go. I'm gonna do that shadow of the stick of the candy. I did 2 parallel lines, and I kept them really light. Yeah, and just fill it in. There we go. And I'll go ahead and even it out some to make sure the dark blends with the light nicely. Make sure it's all the right shade. Okay, I'm pretty happy. I'm gonna go ahead and do the shadow over here. So it's not gonna be much of a shadow because the light is kind of hitting it. We'll make sure not to make the shadow too big because there is light touching that side of the candy. So we'll just have a small shadow. It'll help make that cylindrical shape look 3D and look like it's sitting on a piece of paper, to have a little shadow there. Don't forget, it'll be darker closest to the candy where it hits the table, and then a little lighter further away. I'm just making sure I know where my light source is. Okay. Fill that in and smooth it out. So we are doing one of the darkest shades in the value gradient. The lightest side of the gradient is going to be a tint when it's very light. I will be using a lot of yellow for my tints when I start coloring in the candy. Okay, so here's the last shadow on the last candy. And I'm making sure not to do too much of a shadow closest to the light. You can see I've left it there to remind me. It'll be a little smaller, closer to the light, and then wider and bigger on the opposite side of where the light would hit. I'm trying to mimic that shape of the rectangular candy. It's got a curved corner, so I did a curved corner in my shadow. And these shadows, they can look different too. They do not need to be exactly the shape of the side of your candy. It's actually kind of fun when the shadows are slightly different. Okay, so I just finished the wrapper shadow where it's bunched up. It's darkest toward the end where it hits the table. I'm going to touch up these shadows and make sure I'm happy, make sure they're blended, make sure there's a gradient, dark to light. And you can always use your eraser. If you accidentally make it too dark anywhere, you can just erase some of it. You can also make your darkest dark even darker by layering and going over. Sometimes that's a good way to make your gradient have different levels. You can always just make it darker. Okay, so I have chosen 2 colors, and I would like for you to choose at least 2 colors for each of your candies. Now you may not be able to finish coloring your candy today because we only want to be working on art for about 40 minutes, 40 to 50 minutes, including instructions. So you don't need to finish this today. Don't feel pressure to finish it. You will have time next week also. And if you happen to finish it this week, that's okay too, because I will have some choice board options for everyone if they finish early. But if you don't, it's okay. You can take your time. And see how I'm coloring this. I'm always going to start coloring close to the shadow, and I'm going to use whatever color I'm using is going to be I'm going to press down darker first and make it go dark to light and start at the shadow. I also recommend experimenting with layering these colors on top. It blends them and creates another color. And the color that I am creating is a blue violet because I'm putting purple on top of blue. And it's really pretty. And you can try this with different colors. Do you remember how I just said I like to go over my dark again just to make sure it's nice and dark and it gives more levels to that gradient. So that's cool. You can always make it darker. And I forgot to add some shadows to the wrapper where it's bunched, so I'm going to do that. I just kind of went over my outlines, or just outlined over my pin marks, sorry. Okay, so I'm going to do the next layer inside this candy. Of course, I'm going to start dark, and I've overlapped it over the blue to make a nice blue violet. And I'm not going to add a lot of dark value to that top layer of the candy because it's closest to the light. And you can see here I am finishing up, continuing the same steps as before. So darkest in the shadow and overlap, and then lessen your pressure and you'll have a lighter value or a tint. Okay, I'm going to add a little bit more color in that top part of the candy, but I'm not going to make it too dark because that is the closest place to the light. And I do like to go over and make sure my gradient has lots of steps. I like my gradient to have at least 3 different values: dark, medium, and light. The shadow only has 2, and that works just fine, but on the candy it's nice to try to get to 3. So I'm going back over the dark shadow and blending, and then making the lighter value by not pressing down so hard. So there's variation and a gradient. Okay, moving on here to the stick of the candy, and I'm going to do a dark area. I'm using that blue to make the shadowed side, which is the opposite side to the light source. So it'll be on the right hand side, not on the left. I'm going to fill that in. Okay. So the next step is to continue coloring your candy using color value, starting dark and going light all the way to a tint. And I will be showing you more about that very soon. You will be able to color along with me next week, and we will finish these candies together, or if you're feeling comfortable and you want to go ahead and go on and do it, you can too. Okay, remember to always start with your dark color, and remember to follow the shape of your candy, because unlike our scale that we made, you know how we did dark to light gradient with color, that was rectangular, but all of your candy is different shapes, so try to follow your shapes. Do you see how I'm starting with that here? Okay, everyone, thank you so much for watching. I cannot wait to see what you make and finish these next week. Have a great week.